Hi, everybody, and welcome to the HPL Gallery's Artist Talk series. My name is Jennifer, and today I am so excited to introduce to you artist and educator Astri Snodgrass. Astri's work resists being categorized, and yet it engages with multiple genres such as sculpture and drawing, and methods such as photochemical processes in a way that allows for a dialogue about medium to evolve from her pieces. But I'll stop there and bring in Astri. Thank you so much for doing this today. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this. It's a pleasure.
No problem.
All right. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation here. Here we go. All right. Can you see it?
Yes.
All right. So I'm going to talk about the past couple of years of work and how that's led me into my recent body of work. A recent show of mine was called Every Color is Impossible. So that's kind of the way I'm thinking through this talk and titling it. So as an artist, I come out of a background in drawing and painting, and my first love was painting because it was all about light and color. And in my work, I continue to think about light and color as synonymous and as a kind of energy, because light is color is energy, essentially, if you're thinking about the electromagnetic spectrum. And I'm just constantly fascinated by the sort of almost magical way that painters can mix color, and it's as if they are mixing light itself. In the way that it reflects and absorbs different wavelengths. I'm going to talk a little bit about where I'm coming from in terms of my own lineage, both a lineage in terms of an art historical sense and how my work relates to my own lineage and my own interest in textiles and language. So this is my actual family tree, but I also think of it as a metaphor for how I move through the studio. That my work it comes out of a number of artists throughout art history. It's rooted in this ongoing practice of painting, but painting in a more expanded sense, beyond just traditional kinds of painting. So painting, I think, survives through this method of constantly reinventing itself. Also, my family is Norwegian, so I grew up learning Norwegian as a kid, and spent a year there in Norway when I was 18. So learning that language was pretty formative for me. And also just it sparked this interest in language acquisition and in translation as a form of kind of generative forms of translation. I'm interested in lineage because I'm interested in origins, and not just like familial origins and historical origins, but also mythical origins. This is an image from, it's an illustration of this narrative that Pliny the Elder laid out as the invention of drawing. So this mythological first image. And the story goes that this couple, they were having to say goodbye for the perhaps final time as he was going to depart for war. He was a soldier. And so in her anticipatory grief, his lover traced his shadow on the wall. So what I like about this narrative is that inherent in the, this imagining of image making, it comes out of a connection to light and to sight and touch, as well as embedded in this act of image making is trying to hold on to something that's fleeting or something that's like falling out of your grasp. So that relationship to sight and touch is something that I think about in relating my work to textiles. This is an installation image from several years ago where I was installing these collage works, thinking about them as paper tapestries, trying to reference that, reference the kind of construction of a weaving, of the figure ground reversal. Also trying to almost invite touch, that they are so tactile, they're unexposed, they are exposed, they're uncovered, they aren't framed in. This is an image from my studio where you can see me kind of constructing that form. something that was important to the work at this stage was that the image was constructed at the same time as the support. So rather than starting a painting on a set ground, a rectangle, I was kind of building that at the same time. So similar to how in a textile is in weaving, the image is the structure itself. One of my influences is Annie Albers, and she was a Bauhaus trained weaver, but also a printmaker, and she had a lot of really, I think, incredible writing. In one of her writings, she talks about the limits and the laws of a material, any material, that you have to kind of pay attention to what the material tells you in order to be active. You kind of have to be passive and to let the material dictate what, not dictate, but inform what it is that you make. This is an image of the front and back of one of my pieces that I would make from the back. So it was similar to like pulling a print or making a monotype, because I kind of set up a situation, but I didn't exactly know how things would adhere to that surface. I was also making work on tape at this point. So all of that is kind of like fiber that's adhered to the surface of masking tape. The way that I work is I've been thinking recently about how it's kind of like a garden. Like I'm interested in a garden as a site where you tend things, you tend plants, and then there's like a recycling, there's like a compost situation that happens in my studio where a lot of these materials I carried around with me as I moved across the country for several years. And it just kind of would regenerate itself. And I thought about that as like they have a shared origin, like they share an etymological root almost, or like these two pieces remind me of Pangea splitting apart over time. And I'd like to highlight those connections in terms of how I install the work as well. Another one of my influences is Matisse, and specifically his cutouts, which emerged as a response to his changing body, his aging body, and his sickness that he could no longer paint at this point. So his drawing with scissors and cutting out these forms of gouache on paper was a way of continuing to paint and draw, not as a rejection of it, but as kind of a celebration of it. So finding new ways of working in response to one situation. Thinking about the body, I started to notice like certain compositional structures would also sort of recycle, including ones that reminded me of bodily kind of poses or forms. So these teal forms at the bottom left and bottom right here, I was kind of thinking about them as like hips tilted and in contrapposto with like a rib cage. And it's not that these are like conscious thoughts as I'm making the work, but they're sort of things that I recognize happening. I'm also, referencing weaving and that figure ground reversal, a lot of pattern, a lot of repetition, but always with a large degree of variation. Thinking about Contrapposto, I like, again, origins. I like to think about this period of figurative sculpture from classical antiquity, specifically from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. This being kind of one of the things that's lodged in our contemporary cultural consciousness as establishing white is a color that is timeless and that is classic. And yet we forget that originally these would have been very brightly painted, and the paint has been stripped away by time, right? So like 2,000 years later, no longer has pigment on it. So I like that as a reminder of how paint is, or color is, something that is fleeting, and it can leave this white skeleton behind. So thinking about that like organic matter that is part of this life cycle. This piece is titled Thinking About Color as Something That We Want to Hold On to. But it's sort of also thinking about how we define painting today and all of the different ways that painting can exist or be practiced. If you think about paint is just pigment plus binder plus vehicle, so many different things could be categorized as paint. but I was playing with the idea of bound as like something that's fixed or something that's static. And in naming it that, pointing to the fact that it's not static and it's not time, it's not outside of time, right? Like we like to think about images as being outside of time or not affected by the world and not degrading over time. But here I'm using it both to like point to that desire to hold on to something in color and also using acrylic paint as a kind of adhesive. So materially, I'm exploring bound pigment. That led me to think about how I can flip that or like use a kind of inverted relationship to drawing. So a drawing that comes after a painting. This is a rubbing. So I started making rubbings of those collages because it reveals something else, other characteristics, other qualities of those works that aren't seen in the work itself. Like it's covered up by surface and texture and color. And this really strips it of color, like time has stripped those ancient classical Greek sculptures of pigment. So I thought about it kind of as a sort of memorializing, but also as a way of representing that form in a new way. That led me to some work that involved folding and rubbing just that folded paper. So I like that this plays with what is concealed and what is revealed. This is coming out of like a meditation on the Spanish word doblar, which can be translated as to fold, but also to dub, like a translated voiceover in a movie. So I like that it involved like translation as a sort of transformation, as well as to double. So that idea of multiplication, like that this kind of like infinity, potential for infinity interested me. What I like about rubbing is that in a rubbing, the drawing asserts itself more, or the surface asserts itself more than the hand of the artist. So in that way, I think about it as kind of a democratic approach to drawing. That's less about, draftsmanship, but it's still mimetic. It also has the potential to like go on forever. So this idea of infinity is interesting to me, that I can make a rubbing of a rubbing of a rubbing, and yet each one is unique. I was thinking about Robert Ryman and how he classified any work as that involved line as a drawing, and also how the hardware is part of the work, the hardware with which it's installed. So here I'm not working with like drawing lines, but all of those folds start to become lines, these linear forms that move through the surface. Also the tape, I'm not sure how well you can see that, but this is taped onto the wall. So that was my way of thinking about like expanding that drawing out onto the surface in a way that it's like hidden in plain sight. So after making that work, I was missing color and trying to think about how I could reincorporate color in a way that felt meaningful, a way that felt just as integrated with the surface and with the material as the graphite did on those last folded pieces. So I was thinking about this ancient Greek term pharmakon, which can be translated many different ways. And I think that multiplicity kind of points to the inherent paradoxes in color, that pharmakon can be translated as color or dye or paint or remedy, poison, makeup, venom. And I was thinking about how color can be all of these things, and trying to find a way that I could use color here in a way that was just as tied into the surface. Well, one that would be more of like mortar or more like the skeleton of the drawing than the makeup or the cosmetic on the drawing. So these pieces are coated entirely back and front with layers of parallel lines of colored pencil, and then coated in cold wax medium to kind of seal it. That surface builds up to a point where it starts to break down. So that's my interest in like the compost, or the destruction being tied to creation. I'm also thinking about how like imagining that as I'm laying down these colors, I'm not just laying down material, but I'm also playing with the way that light reflects. So light equals color equals energy. If we're thinking about the electromagnetic spectrum as different forms of energy, we only have this like small portion of it that is actually visible to the human eye. And it's sort of the difference between color and colors that I'm interested in. Like Agnes Martin is one of my favorite artists, and she talks about how her work is about perfection, but it is far from perfect. And similarly, I think that this work is about infinity, or about colors, like all of the colors, that desire, that insatiable desire as a painter to have access to every and any color or color relationship, and that's inherently an impossible desire, like that's unattainable, because there's a difference between like the 11 different color terms that any language has for basic colors, and then the color as a continuum, as a spectrum of what the eye can actually see. This is one of the early images that like moments, experiences that I had that had me thinking about light as something that's haptic, something that you experience in space and time, and you experience it in a tactile sense. This is from outside of Woods Hall at the University of Alabama, where I went to graduate school, right outside of my studio on one day, rare day, that it was very snowy, and the sun had melted the snow in the pattern of the wrought iron in that shadow. And I thought that this so perfectly encapsulated what I want to do in the studio, and that it has this beautiful relationship between cause and effect, and between form and like what causes it, between light and like sight and touch as well. This is an image from my studio I'm in now, rearranged a little bit. I tend to work where I overextend beyond the limits of my studio space. So this is a little larger than what my drafting table can handle, but it shows you. So I fold and I unfold, and with each folded iteration, I lay down a new layer of color so that those all start to kind of bind together. And this body of work is titled Opposite of Prism, because I'm thinking about, in a kind of poetic sense, what would the opposite of a prism be? What would that look like? So a prism splits a white beam of light into all of its constituent colors, but what would the opposite of that do? Like, how could I stitch all of those colors back together in a way that's reducing and absorbing light in a different way? And also, this was a really physical process. So this had like a direct effect on my body that I ended up having to go to physical therapy for, because it was so physically demanding. This piece is made on tracing paper, so it's a little bit more translucent. You can see through it, building up that color not only on the surface, but that you can also see through the surface. More recently, since it was so difficult on my body to be exerting that much pressure, like I've been thinking about tension, in part because I've learned to weave in the past 2 years, and tension is so important in weaving. Like, you have to maintain tension in order for everything to be even. But in this case, tension was like transferring from or between my body and the drawing. And I felt like I needed a gentler visual language, and a gentler language just for myself, because I think it's like similar with gardening. You have to take care of yourself in order to take care of the garden. So I started working more with liquid colors. So this is ink and gouache that I use in these little tubes to dispense. What's interesting to me about this, on a really fragile looking but strong kozo paper or mulberry paper, is that it bleeds through. So there's like another layering of mirroring or reflecting that happens through the folds. These are also stitched together. So I'm starting to work more, like traverse more towards the fiber end of things. I should also mention these are all scaled to my body in some way. So even the folded works sometimes get pretty large, but everything has this like scale relationship to my body so that I can handle it and manage it. And I guess I kind of relate that to the loom. Like the loom is a direct extension of the body. These are kind of a direct extension of my body. So then I started working more with actual fiber. This is on muslin, colored pencil and cold wax medium, wax pastels, and ink. Thinking again about origins, this is an image that kind of describes a little bit of the way that I grew up. So this is from my mom's cousin's cabin in Norway. And although it's not the space where I grew up in Illinois, it is indicative of like that, the amount of and the variety of different kinds of textiles that are both utilitarian and decorative, and how that kind of formed my visual language growing up. Annie Albers talks about how in one of her writings that like she feels indebted to early textile artisans who like we can actually attribute our survival to, because textile is the first form of shelter of the body. So like if you think far enough back in time, textiles are like what allow us as a species to continue. So I'm constantly thinking about the relationship between fiber and my body, or fiber and a female body, a woman's body. And I recently read a book called Women's Work, the First 20,000 Years. It's about the archaeological, well, what's missing in the archaeological data of what did women contribute to society, because textiles don't survive for 20,000 years. But essentially she talks about like why the work of making and producing clothing or textiles was predominantly a woman's job in prehistoric society, that it had this relationship to child rearing, that it's something that you can pick up and put down as needed. And it's not like your tools are really dangerous. So it was well suited for like being able to be interrupted and take care of a child. So I'm thinking about tending, and I'm thinking about care and how that relates to this work, and like how it relates both to the art, but also to yourself and to the world around you. So this led me to learn to weave. This is an image of the loom, the first piece that I had on the loom before I took it off, where I was thinking about like, how do you work within the limits of this new material, this new medium? Like this is inherently binary. It's warp and weft. So you can only go over and under, and it's by necessity, it's a rectangle, at least to start. So I had to think about how I could break up that rectangle. I don't know why I have such an aversion to rectangles, but I started folding this, as well as I'm weaving, I can kind of weave in triangular structures to break apart that rectilinearity. This also forced me to think about color, the way that I use color. So when I'm working with collage or when I'm working with paint, I'm applying color to or letting color seep into a material. I mean, these are really foundational concepts, but in weaving, you're like starting with the dyed fiber, and then you're intertwining that. So that creates pattern that also, like at a distance, creates a plane of color. And so that kind of had me thinking about, how can a color be? Like what does color do? How does it drive us? How does it motivate us? Color can be a paint, or it can be like in, on, or of a material. And it can, and like any combination of those things. But ultimately, color is what drives us. Like it motivates us on so many different levels, for good and for bad. Like it can spark appetite or arousal or hatred or bigotry. And I guess what I'm pointing to is like, it's so far beyond just limited to the formal. And then this is my last image that I wanted to end on, because it's more of a quilt. And I think that it kind of circles back to some of the compositional forms I had before. And it's in this sort of state of becoming. So like I was in the process of kind of like opening it back up. It's lots and lots of layers that are kind of intertwined. And I decided to stop in that process because this to me feels more like it's in a state of becoming still. And that speaks to the fact that color is always happening. Like it's an action, it's a verb. It's something that like light is bouncing and hitting our eyes continuously, but we don't think about it in the present or like the here and now. So I liked that this was sort of like being disemboweled or emerging from a cocoon, and how that speaks to like the just here and now-ness of color. So that's it.
Well, we're doing really great on time, so I've got questions for you.
Okay. Should I keep this up?
Yeah, keep it up for a little while. And it's funny because like sometimes in these talks, I hit the nail right on the head with my questions, and my questions this time like went in a completely different direction than you did. You went in with like color and textiles, and my questions are like paper and form. So it's,
I mean, that's still something that I think about. I don't know. I think like the garden idea is that like it's all related and it's all kind of supporting one another. Like I tend to work that way actually, where I'm working on like the textile work, the weavings at the same time that I'm like making these ink paintings.
mm-hmm.
And that there's something really fertile in that, being able to jump from one to the other.
Your weaving pieces that you showed are just really satisfying to see. Like, like, cause it's like you click like,
Yeah.
Oh, I see it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just paper, you know?
Right.
Mm-hmm. But,
and it's funny, a colleague of mine was like, oh, you're living the metaphor.
Yeah.
Like you're doing the thing now that like you've been referencing for so long, and now you're actually trying it. And the funny thing is when I butt up against that and I'm like, but I can't break the rectangle. This feels really limiting.
Well, I'm just going to fold this, but like the colors were so satisfying in your week. Like just that first one that you showed, it was just like, I just wanted to eat it.
Yeah.
It's so satisfying to see the colors mesh with each other like that. Okay, questions. In your work, there seems to be a dialogue between two elements or a binary subject, your mark and your form. Mm-hmm. But you create this very solid shape and space where these elements cannot escape. They are contained. The pieces remind me of rocks in a way. What are your thoughts on this form? And how do you utilize the act of repetition in your practice?
I like the rocks reference because I do think about geological time in a sense, or like evolutionary time, like, because it's not as if I'm making work that's going to like fade away tomorrow or next year, but we're so focused on like the human time scale that. And I guess more recently, I've been thinking about like the ethics of color, like how ethical is it that we consume color, and like all of the damage that does to our environment, and like how sustainable is that, and how can we have more ethical consumption of color, both as consumers and as artists. But that gets a little bit away from your question. So I like the rocks thing. You're talking about the form being really self-contained. And I think ultimately that's what I'm looking for. And I have a tendency to want to overwork or just keep going and going and going. And I have to stop myself when it reaches a point where I feel like this can be no other way. Where it does feel like so solidified that it doesn't need, any 10 additional layers or something. And then repetition, I think I work across multiple surfaces at once. That's pretty important to me so that I can be, I think, more free. I don't have to commit to every surface in the same way. And so I am kind of just like generating a lot of material most of the time. I mean, I feel like 80% of what I do in the studio is like setting up my palette. like just playing with color before I actually find the form. And then the form is just sort of like me putting pause on that process. When it feels like it surprises me and it's like, oh, that's done. But it's almost as if that happens more organically as I'm playing with color or as I'm playing with folding. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I think that maybe those outside of the field of art see work like yours and might wonder why you're in this pattern, how you can stay in this pattern and make so many things that are like the same thing, but it's a variation of it. I don't wonder that, but I wonder if, those outside of the field of art think that. I think like repetition and like a sustained gesture is a nice, it's just a form of exploration. And you do that really nicely.
It's the same thing about people who like jog every day. It's like, it's an exercise. It's something you do it because you love it, or you do it because for me, it really is similar to knitting. I grew up knitting. I've been knitting since I was like 6. And that like repetitive process where you can, or like swimming is a form of exercise I really like, because you're fully immersed in it. And your body can't focus on anything else, but that really frees up your mind and it's really relaxing. And there's something important in that process for getting in the right headspace. Because I'm often bouncing around, like it's not as repetitive as it looks, because I'll be bouncing around and I'll be writing for a little while and then I'll be working on as if writing's not working. Then I'll be like painting for a while. But it's a lot of back and forth. I think in order to find the language for what I'm doing, I really have to be in motion.
We've got time for another question. I'll shoot another one. Okay.
Yeah.
So I really enjoy how when I look at your work, my object recognition is messed with. Like I tend to focus on the materiality of the work, perhaps much more than I do with painting or sculpture. That is more static in its genre reference. Meaning I find myself looking past the application of color and your mark making, and I fixate on the paper and your forms. Will you talk about paper a little bit and how or why you've landed on this as your medium?
Yeah. I mean, paper it's a very familiar material. Everybody has a tactile relationship with paper. Everyone has written on, held, experienced paper in a tactile and in a visual sense. So I like to take a material that's really familiar and work it until it becomes unfamiliar, because I think there's something special in being able to have that leap, that transformation that isn't dependent on like really fancy materials, but that can show, like, again, I guess it goes back to that idea of like a democratic gesture or a democratic material, that it's more, I think about it as a point of entry, because once you find out that it's paper, I think it brings you in a little bit. Ideally, it brings you in a little bit more, and it makes you investigate a little bit closer, because like the first impact is like the color or the materiality, but not like the materiality of the paper that's familiar. So I think that's, I think about how am I repurposing something that is, I don't want to use the word universal. I don't like that term, but something that is really familiar to a lot of different kinds of people. Right. And that's the same thing goes with fiber. Everyone has a relationship to fiber, and like the kinds of fibers that they like to wear, or the kinds of clothes that they need to wear for their job. Yeah. So I think that's what it's about.
And the opposite is true of like canvas and painting on canvas or sculpture.
Right. Yeah, because that's a little bit more insular. Like if you don't know how a mold is made, If you don't know how that works, then it's a little more mysterious. I guess I like my work to be mysterious in a sense, but then I guess maybe the hook is like, this is mysterious, but it's something you know. Like, you don't have to go up and touch the paper to know that it's how paper feels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, this was really great. I really enjoyed hearing you talk about, you know, all of your ideas and process and your practice. It was just really so wonderful.
Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure.
Yeah. So we'll officially log off and say farewell. Thank you for tuning in and watching and listening to Astri talk about her work.
Thank you.